Alvin, in our last conversation, we dealt heavily with your involvement in the community of Oak Ridge. When I think of you, I think of someone who doesn't pass up many opportunities to say something nice about Oak Ridge as a place to live. I hate to call you an Oak Ridge.
It's a great place.
Yeah, I hate to call you an Oak Ridge chauvinist because that indicates
Well, okay.
So you're an Oak Ridge chauvinist.
People ask me, why do you stay in Oak Ridge? They say, come down to Oak Ridge and see the way we live here in Oak Ridge. You'll understand.
Come down and see how healthy we are, and maybe you won't be so afraid of radiation. Right. But you were quite a figure and have been quite a figure and still are quite a figure in Washington. Now, you were with 3 different presidents in different roles. As I recall, you had an office in the White House under Kennedy. It was a summer project. I'm sure I'm oversimplifying it. And then you were actually an administrator during the Nixon administration. And Ford, both, 4 presidents. And I think for a short period of time, you were a campaign advisor to Jimmy Carter. I think that kind of ended on a...
I met with him one time, and I have pictures of it.
Recall a little bit about that summer in the White House with the Kennedy administration and what you were doing there.
Well, in 1958, I was asked by George Kiskikowski, who was then Eisenhower's science advisor, to join the President's Science Advisory Committee. I think actually I was recommended to him by I. Rabi, Nobel Prize winner, who used to visit Oak Ridge. In fact, he spent a summer in Oak Ridge.
The 4th one who was here at Gene's opening.
That could be, I've forgotten. And I did serve on the President's Science Advisory Committee in 59, 60, and 61, I believe it was, so that I straddled the Eisenhower presidency and on into the Johnson presidency. And Kiskikowski was science advisor, no, not Johnson, Kennedy, I'm sorry. Kiskikowski was science advisor for Eisenhower, and Jerry Wiesner was a science advisor for Mr. Kennedy. In all frankness, I don't think I was a terribly effective member of the President's Science Advisory Committee. I guess I felt, as I look back on those days, that my attitudes were a little bit too Oak Ridge parochial, if you like. Must realize, however, that the President's Advisory Committee was made up almost entirely, not quite entirely, but almost entirely, of academic scientists from the universities. And so the bias tended always to be towards the universities. And I was always a voice that was trying to represent the government laboratories, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, well, not specifically Oak Ridge, but the idea that national laboratories were an important element in the science configuration and that they deserved a great deal of support. And so I don't think I was very popular, really. George Kiskikowski wrote a book, Scientists of the White House, and in it he criticizes me basically for this position. But I think I did one thing that turned out to be much more important than many of the members of the committee thought at the time. In 1961, I think it was, Jerry Wiesner asked me to chair a panel that would examine the whole question of scientific information, the idea that there's a glut of information. How do you handle the information? How do you keep the glut of information from suffocating scientific progress? And so we formed a very distinguished panel. Francois Cortez from Oak Ridge was the secretary of the panel, and he was very helpful in carrying on the deliberation of the panel. And finally, in 1963, or perhaps it was 1962, I guess it was 1962, I spent the summer in the White House actually putting together the deliberations of the panel and writing a report, which was called Science, Government, and Information. Sometimes some people call it the Weinberg report because I was the chairman of the panel. And it's turned out that that report has had a very great influence on the way the community of scientific communicators, librarians, analysts, purveyors of scientific information, look at the whole problem of scientific information. So as I look back on my period at the President's Science Advisory Committee, I feel that that was the main thing that I contributed. I guess I should also say that it was because I was on the President's Scientific Advisory Committee for that period that I began thinking about the larger questions involved in the management of science, the support of science in a democratic society such as the United States. And it was during that tenure that I gave this speech at the American Rocket Society the night before Alan Shepard made his first trip into space. That was the first time an American had got into space. And it was yes, and it was in that speech that I coined the term big science, which has now become a word that everybody uses. And I raised the question in that speech, will our support of big science, these big science spectaculars, push out the support for little science? Here it is almost 35 years later, and that question is being asked with more and more urgency now, because now the big science spectaculars, instead of costing $10 million, cost close to $10 billion. The superconducting super collider, the price of it just went up, and it's now estimated to cost maybe $8.5 billion. $8.5 billion. The Human Genome Project cost maybe $3 or $4 billion. And so just last week in Science Magazine, there was a group of Harvard biologists who were raising the question, do we really want to do the Human Genome Project, at this rate at any rate, when there are so many small projects that are proposed by very competent investigators for the NIH who just aren't getting funded. And it's particularly difficult for the young people who are starting in science now, because it used to be that a young person starting in science, if he had a good idea, if he was a competent person, the National Institutes of Health would fund him. Now I think the number of new projects, and this means young people who are just getting started, they're being funded way, way down, so far down that people are very much worried that young people will turn away from science. Why should they go into science if it's such a hassle? How can they get money to keep going? Or another aspect, if they never get tenure at an academic institution, but always have to depend on so-called soft money, which means that they have to get their grant established in the first place and then renewed every year. Why should they go into that hassle? Instead, they can become, I don't know, a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, but not a scientist. A very real and difficult question. I don't know what the answer to it really is.
Well, I remember that Gatlinburg speech very well. I remember you're coming up, I happened to be there, you coming up to me and said, Dick, you better listen carefully, I'm going to let him have it this evening, and indeed you did. You obviously knew what you were doing. I remember you compared the space program as the possibly historically being thought of as we now think of the pyramids, as a...
pyramids or cathedrals.
Yeah, do you still feel that way?
I have mixed feelings. I think I was wrong in that I underestimated the extraordinary political and public impact that the landing on the moon had. As a matter of fact, I thought that we would never do the moon landing in the time that President Kennedy said that we'd do it. We'd do it in the decade of the 1960s. On the other hand, I think we are beginning to see in the problems that are surrounding NASA a profound basic difficulty, and that is that NASA is not very clear as to what its mission is. Is its mission to send a man to Mars? Is its mission to simply have a space station? What scientific knowledge will we get from activities like that that really is worth the amount of money that NASA wishes to spend? Very, very difficult problems. And I guess I am much more inclined to say that there ought to be a reexamination of NASA's role, redistribution of our scientific resources, so that those problems which are obviously difficult problems that are really going to impact on us in a tremendous way, we should really solve those problems. And in fact, I've written editorials recently in which I say that if I had to choose between, say, the superconducting collider and getting nuclear energy back on track, I would say spend the money to get nuclear energy on track. Now, at that time, I said we had enough money to do both, which is great. But I don't think we have enough money to, say, send the man to Mars and at the same time get nuclear energy back on track. I think the energy problem is going to haunt us, and we see what's happened with Iraq, and it will become increasingly difficult and will have an increasing impact on the way people live, on the stability of the world. And that should be elevated once more to the extraordinary priority that it had immediately after the war.
Your, I guess, was it a year that you were with the Nixon administration, or was it that long?
After I left the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, I was invited to head the Office of Energy Research and Development, which was in the White House. It wasn't actually in the White House itself, it was in the Executive Office building, which is attached to the White House. And of course, you must realize that most of the work of the White House is not done in the White House, it's done in the Executive Office building. And in fact, about 50 yards from my office in the White House was the famous office where Mr. Nixon was tampering with the tapes. He would do his tape business and a good deal of his business, not in the White House, but in the Executive Office building. Well, I was asked to head up this office, and I said to, well, it was actually John Sawhill, who was first at the Office of Management and Budget and then became the director of the Federal Energy, the administrator of the Federal Energy Administration. I told him, okay, I'll come for a year. This was right after the first oil shock of 1974. And so I showed up January 5th or so, 1974. Two people from Oak Ridge came with me. One was Cal Burwell, and the other was Elizabeth Richardson. And we set up this office. I had some other consultants from Oak Ridge. Most notably was H.G. McPherson, who had been the deputy director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And we set up our office. Well, you set up an office in Washington, and then after you get your American flag planted in the stanchion, first thing that happened that morning was a guy comes in with coffee and cream and an American flag, which is the one thing they allow you to keep when you leave office. I also spoke at that time to the former governor of Colorado, who had been the previous occupant of that office. Very fancy office, by the way. It used to be in 1880 or so, the main headquarters of the Navy Department. Very, very fancy office. Well, then you begin thinking, what are we here for? And I'm afraid that nobody could quite tell us what we were there for. We were supposed to somehow formulate energy research and development policy for the entire United States. Well, we finally got our bearings, and we did do a few things that were, I think, very useful. Perhaps the most important, as I look back on it, was that our office was responsible for the establishment of the Solar Energy Research Institute. People don't realize that Alvin Weinberg, an old newt.
Does Barry Commoner know that you...
Probably not. Probably not. In fact, the people at the Solar Energy Research...
Barry Commoner being the
yes.
advocate of solar energy to the exclusion of nuclear energy.
Well, yes.
Not necessarily one of your professional friends, right?
Well, he's a professional, what shall I say, antagonist, and I've argued with him many times. But we decided that it was of the utmost importance to pursue solar energy seriously. The way to do it was to establish an institution which would have commitment to solar energy, form a bureaucracy. There are people whose livelihoods depended upon getting on with solar energy, and that's really how the Solar Energy Institute started. It didn't really get off the ground completely until about 3 years later, but finally you now have a place out in near Boulder, Colorado, Golden, Colorado, where they have a Solar Energy Research Institute. The other thing that we did, we were very much involved in converting the Atomic Energy Commission into the Energy Research and Development Administration. We would go around collaring senators, in particular Chet Hollifield, who you may recall, well, he was House of Representatives, but he was not only involved with the Atomic Energy Commission, but he was also involved with government reorganization. That was one of the reasons why he was such a powerful figure in the Congress. And he had to be convinced that it was a good idea to abolish the Atomic Energy Commission, convert it the Energy Research and Development Administration. Well, to make a long story short, I did my duty, I suppose. I didn't like being in Washington. My good friend, the famous oceanographer Roger Revelle, who at one time was the science advisor to the Department of Interior, I asked him one time, Roger, how do you like Washington? And he says to me, well, Washington is all right, but it's a very knifey place. And that's what I found, that Washington's a very knifey place, with everybody trying to escalate his power, his position, who you talk to, how you talk to them, and so on. So I wasn't very happy there. And although I didn't have a calendar in which I crossed off the days, my commitment was to stay for 365 days. I stayed actually for 347 days, came back to Oak Ridge, and I think I made the right decision. I might say that at that time also, the Institute for Energy Analysis was established as much as anything to support the work of our Office of Energy Research and Development. I've always been forever grateful to my good friend H.G. McPherson, Mac we call him, for becoming the acting director of the Institute for Energy Analysis during that year when I was away in Washington.
Alvin, I've learned a lot of history from you, listening to your talks. I didn't know what a Luddite was until I heard you mention it in one of your State of the Laboratory talks. Now I go around talking about Luddites, they being the people who were anti-technologists back in the mid-19th century.
Early 19th.
And I just learned a lot that I didn't know about. I knew there were witches, but I learned a lot about witchcraft in reading one of your more recent speeches, the one you made in October at the National Academy of Sciences, in which you made the analogy between witchcraft and the evolving attitudes for witchcraft and radiation.
That's not my idea. That idea is a beautiful idea, which comes from Bill Clark, who spent a couple of years with us at the Institute for Energy Analysis. He's an ecologist. He's now at Harvard University, and he wrote this wonderful article, Witches, Floods, and Wonder Drugs, in which he pointed out that this irrational fear that we now have, that everything is killing us, is very much like the fear of witches that pervaded Western Europe in the 13th, 14th, 15th, even 16th century. Over 1 million women mainly were burned at the stake as witches because if somebody, your cow dies, that wasn't because the cow got sick, it was because that witch, a woman usually, almost always, had hexed the cow. And therefore what you had to do was burn the witch at the stake. Now, that continued on into the 17th century. The Salem witchcraft trials were an episode in that period. Witchcraft finally died out, not because people no longer believed in witches, but rather they ruled that you could not use torture to elicit a confession. And therefore, people who were accused of being witches, they say, no, I'm not a witch. Now, in the old days, you would torture them and they say, I was a witch, and then you could burn them at the stake. But if you couldn't torture them, then, and witchcraft, which was a growth industry for a long time, suddenly collapsed. And what I was implying, and Bill Clark first said this very beautifully in that article, was that the finding of all these little miasmas in the environment that are killing us all has become a growth industry. Every month now we find another miasma, an insult, which is a byproduct of our technology that's killing us all. But it's clearly irrational because we're all living longer. The life expectancy of people in the United States has increased by an astonishing 20 years in the past half century. It's an astonishing increase. And that's true throughout the Western world. So, although there are more miasmas out there, more insults, we're living longer. Somehow there's a gross disconnect.
Being radiation and fear.
Well, radiation, but that's only one. Dioxins, PCBs, the stuff, the alar on the apples. Everybody thinks he's dying from one of these miasmas, and yet everybody's living longer. It's crazy, just utterly crazy, irrational.
Well, you said in this talk that witchcraft went out of fashion or ceased to be a growth industry largely because a certain group of elitists became convinced that you mentioned Tom Wicker and his column in which he allowed us how maybe nuclear power isn't so bad after all. Would you classify him and maybe the anchor people on television as some of those elitists who, if they came around gradually, that might have the effect of easing this phobia?
I think you're right, Dick, that as I see it, the attitudes of the public are largely fashioned in this age of television by what I call the skeptical elites. The skeptical elites are knowledgeable people who are very skeptical of the technologies. Ralph Nader, for example, is one example. He's fundamentally skeptical of much of modern technology. A man like Paul Ehrlich, who is a population bomb fellow, and he says we have to reduce the population. Barry Commoner is an example of one of the skeptical elites who really think that our technology is fundamentally flawed and that we have to go in a different direction. Now, these people influence the media, the experts in communication, the Tom Brokaws, Ted Koppels of television, and that's the dynamic which results in this terrible, exaggerated fear of the fact that we're all dying prematurely, which we aren't. And so I've said that I think that the way to reduce these phobias is to somehow first improve the technologies where improvement is possible, and I think it is possible to improve nuclear technology, and then not to try to directly convince the public, because I don't think that works very well. If I go out and make a speech. I don't know, a few hundred scientists or engineers will hear it, but that doesn't affect the public. No, what you have to do is convince the skeptical elite that the technology has been made more benign. And that has actually begun to happen with respect to nuclear energy. I spoke at a meeting on carbon dioxide and nuclear energy at Virginia Tech not long ago. Paul Ehrlich was there, and he heard my talk. And would you believe that Paul Ehrlich, whom I think you once told me refused to shake your hand when you met him, when he found out that you were from Oak Ridge, and he said...
that happened at an editor's meeting.
That's right. And he said, that's where that king of the technological optimist, Alvin Weinberg, comes. I won't shake your hand.
It happened on the Queen Mary in Long Beach.
Right. And would you believe that that same Paul Ehrlich, in his plenary lecture, and he gives a beautiful plenary lecture, conceded that he, in view of the greenhouse problem, is no longer against nuclear energy and becomes a supporter of nuclear energy if it is based on these new improved nuclear energy systems. It's quite extraordinary. That's an example of what I mean about convincing the skeptical elite. Then you convince the television personalities, and then you convince the public. And that, I think, is the way it has to go.
Speaking of television, in this talk that you gave in October, you talked a lot about the inherently safe reactor, but you also used the term inherently safe television. What do you mean by inherently safe television?
Inherently safe television. Is it possible to have a television that doesn't scare the wits out of everybody through its exaggeration of some of these concerns? And I don't know what the answer to that is. What I mean, of course, is that is it possible to have the television community, and I'm not talking about Joan Ellen Zucker, she's blameless in this regard, the television community to have a more rational attitude towards these concerns that very quickly become escalated. Well, the Allard episode, for example, had it not been for television, people would, not have placed it in proper perspective. Hardly a day goes by that you don't find on the television somebody saying that, well, here's another thing that's going to kill us. But the fact is, it isn't killing us. We're all living longer. That's what I mean by inherently safe television. It's basically having a cadre of television communicators who fundamentally are more rational about these matters than they are now.
Could you tell us a little bit about the term inherently safe reactor? We're hearing it a lot. I presume we're going to hear it a lot more. And could you give us a rather quick layman's definition of an inherently safe reactor, nuclear power reactor?
A nuclear power plant has enormous amounts of radioactivity in it, as you saw in Chernobyl. And Chernobyl was a reactor in which there was a terrible accident. It was basically a nuclear accident. About 12 or 13 years ago, about the time that Sweden decided to cut out nuclear energy, some of the Swedish nuclear engineers, in particular a man by the name of Kara Hanertz, asked the question, is it possible to design nuclear reactors for which it is essentially incredible to have a big accident? At the same time, people like Peter Fortescue in this country at General Atomics, and some people, Reutler and Lohnert in Germany, were asking that same question. Actually, David Lilienthal was involved because shortly after the 3 Mile Island accident, he wrote a little book called Atomic Energy, A New Start, in which instead of saying, let's get rid of atomic energy, he said, no, what we must do is send the nuclear engineers back to the drawing board and see where they can design systems for which nuclear accidents like 3 Mile Island, let alone Chernobyl, are essentially impossible. I became very interested in this possibility about that time, and we organized a study And fortunately, the Mellon Foundation was willing to support the study. They gave us about $450,000 to conduct the study at the Institute for Energy Analysis. And we said, can we contemplate a rebirth of nuclear energy, a second nuclear era, if you wish, based on nuclear reactors that were very much safer than existing reactors. By this I meant that their safety did not depend on mechanical or human interventions of a timely sort, but rather were based on inherent properties of the reactor or absolute physical laws like law of gravity, that things go towards the Earth, they don't fly upward naturally. And that's how we happen to use the term inherently safe reactors. Is actually a term that was used in Sweden. I found out later that the idea of inherently safer chemical plants had been invented by a man in England by the name of Trevor Kletz, who in 1975, shortly after the terrible accident at Flicksborough in England, where a chemical plant blew up and 28 people were killed, he raised the question, is it possible to design chemical plants which are inherently safer? Bhopal, for example, a terrible accident, perhaps the worst technological accident, certainly in many ways much worse than Chernobyl. If you look at what was wrong with the design of the Bhopal chemical plant, it was that instead of confining this terrible MIC, a terribly toxic material, in a whole bunch of small containers, so that if any one container blew up, not all that much would happen, they had 3 enormously large containers, about 30 tons of this awful stuff in each one of these containers. And when one of them blew, that was it. There are some MIC plants, not the one in India, where you never have more than about this much MIC in any one place. That's an example of a reactor, of a chemical plant, that is inherently much safer than the other. So by inherently safe, a term, incidentally, which many people object to because the implication is inherently safe means absolutely safe. By inherently safe, we really mean a system whose safety depends not on mechanical or electronic or human interventions, but rather on laws of nature, on passive systems, as we call them.
Carrying this to the extreme, the ridiculous, a really inherently safe reactor would be one that didn't have any radiation in it. I mean, right? Right. Alvin, there are many things we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about Alvin Weinberg, the tennis player. I understand you're a mean tennis player. People who play with you tell me you're very crafty and very... well, I don't mean is not the proper word, but you're very good. We haven't talked about Alvin Weinberg, the piano player. I understand you're rehearsing right now intensely for a coffee concert, I believe, on October 28th. Okay. I'd like to just sort of conclude. Your book, I just happened to have my copy with me. I don't know whether this was your first book. I know it was one of your earlier ones. Reflections on Big Science. What do you find yourself, other than the things that we've talked about, or perhaps some of the things we've already talked about, what do you find yourself reflecting on most of all, the times that you're thoughtful, thinking back? What particular subjects?
Well, if I think of that book and ask myself, what is the most important thought that I put forward in that book, I think it was a basically philosophic question. And it's sort of I felt a kind of neat twist on the philosophy of science. There is a large philosophic literature called the philosophy of science, in which people ask the basic question, how does a scientist decide that such and such a scientific theory or scientific observation is true? So the philosophy of science traditionally has dealt with the question of scientific truth. How do you decide that this science is true, that it's better in the sense of being truer than that scientific discovery? And there's a big literature, and there are many chairs of philosophy of science throughout the world. I introduced in that little book a different kind of question, which was not the philosophy of science, which deals with how do you decide whether a given scientific activity or finding is true. Rather, the philosophy of scientific administration. You see, I'm primarily a scientific administrator, and so it was not all that unusual for me to speculate on, is there something which might be called the philosophy of scientific administration? Now, what is the basic problem of scientific administration? Well, on the one hand, there's housekeeping. Who do you hire? How do you get the money? And so on. But that's the lesser issue. The primary issue in scientific administration is the allocation of resources. You have two people who offer equally good or seemingly equally good scientific proposals. And to bring it down to earth, the supercolliding superconductor on the one hand and the Human Genome Project on the other. $8 billion, $3 billion, whatever. And you're the scientific administrator. Is there any way, from philosophic principles, of deciding that this thing is better than that thing, granted that both of them will lead to true results? So that what you are asking when you talk about scientific, the philosophy of scientific administration is not, how do you decide whether this is true or that's true? That's not the question you ask. Rather, you're asking, which is more valuable? Which is more valuable? And so what I talked about in that book, and I still think that it's valid, is I tried to establish criteria by means of which one can judge the scientific merit, the value of scientific activities, because I believe that's the fundamental philosophic question that administrators are always having to utilize, although they don't do it explicitly. And it's had actually considerable influence. There's been kind of a cottage industry, I guess, that grew out of these deliberations, these papers, which I called criteria for scientific choice. You understand what I mean by that? What are the criteria that an administrator ought to use in deciding between two scientific activities, not both of which are true, but how to decide which is more valuable? Well, as I say, there has been a cottage industry growing up around this question of the philosophy of scientific administration, and I occasionally Rip Van Winkle-like write a paper saying where I think the issue stands. Now, it's kind of interesting, for example, the National Science Foundation, which is always trying to decide which to support, which not support, and they send out these statements to peer reviewers to say, how are you going to you decide which one is more important, which isn't. And the criteria, which is National Science Foundation now proposes for use by its peer reviewers, really is quite similar to the criteria that I proposed about 25 years ago in these papers on criteria for scientific choice. So you ask, what do I think in that book is still valid? I think that's pretty valid still.
What do you think our number one scientific priority should be right now?
Why do you ask such difficult questions?
Well, I thought that I knew what your answer was going to be.
Yeah, well, I would repeat that I think getting the energy situation in hand. And of course, I am enough of a nuke still. I'm proud to continue to be a nuke, to say that getting nuclear energy back on track should have an extremely high priority, and the government ought to be involved in it.
Alvin,
in this respect, I'm expressing my liberal instincts rather than my conservative instincts. Yeah.
Alvin, we began this conversation on a big idea, and I think we've ended it on a big idea. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity to talk with you like this. And I think now it's time we let you get back to practicing your Mozart for that coffee concert, October the 28th, right? Where? At the Pollard?
No, it's at the Unitarian Church.
Unitarian Church. Alvin, thank you so much for
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you a lot.
Perfect. The will of the people.